start of civil war.
In April 1646, at the height of the English Civil War, 3 men in disguise fled Oxford. But these men were not deserters or criminals. One of them was King Charles I. Accompanied by 2 loyal courtiers, he hurried through the night, hoping to flee the country. Parliament immediately issued orders for his arrest. The King of England, Ireland and Scotland was now a fugitive.
Charles's predicament couldn't have been worse. This most self-important of kings was reduced to scurrying around his kingdom in the dead of the night, disguised as a servant.
In 1640, Charles I had started a civil war over religion and the power of monarchy. In Scotland, the war degenerated into a clan feud, while in Ireland, the conflict ignited sectarian hatred between Catholics and Protestants. In England, set-piece battles between Roundheads and Cavaliers killed thousands. But by 1646, the Royalist Cavaliers were spent as a military force, and Parliament's Roundheads were closing in on the king.
As Charles fled through the night, he found himself travelling in the fens of East Anglia. This dark, brooding landscape was home to his most deadly enemy, the brilliant commander of the Roundheads, Oliver Cromwell. A man who was absolutely determined to end the war of the last 4 years, the war which had now ravaged England, Ireland and Scotland.
Charles had hit rock bottom. After weeks on the run, the king ended up here in Norfolk, at the Swan pub in Downham Market. As he burned private papers in his room, King Charles despaired over his next move.
Charles knew he could expect little mercy from Cromwell, so instead he made an extraordinary decision. After 4 days holed up here in this small town, deep inside enemy territory, he chose to hand himself in to the very people he had gone to war with in the beginning, Parliament's allies, the Scottish Covenanters.
9 years earlier, these men had signed a covenant rejecting the king's religious reforms in Scotland. The Scottish Covenanters had fought alongside Parliament to defend their Protestant religion, but now they feared the growing religious extremism of Parliament, and the alliance between them began to crumble. Charles realised he was facing a divided opposition.
Ever the opportunist, Charles saw his surrender to the Scottish Covenanters as a way of splitting the alliance fighting against him. To Charles, it was just another tactic towards reclaiming what was rightfully his.
Accompanied by 2 loyal courtiers, Charles set out across the flat fen landscape of East Anglia. At 6 a.m. on May the 5th, 1646, the king surrendered himself to the Scottish Covenanters, who were laying siege to the royalist town of Newark. But as ever in the wars of the 1640s, events in another kingdom could upset the best-laid plans. With the king in their possession, the Covenanter-Parliament alliance seemed triumphant. But in Ireland, Charles's allies, the Confederates, achieved an astounding victory that would totally upset the Covenanter-Parliament plans. In June 1646, the Catholic Confederates hammered the Protestants at the Battle of Ben Burb. Ireland had been ravaged by 5 years of civil war between these two opposing religions. Parliament had backed the Protestants, while Charles had eventually allied himself with the Catholics. The Catholic victory at Ben Burb in Ireland terrified both the Roundheads and the Scottish Covenanters. In the face of this Catholic victory, Parliament and the Covenanters settled their differences. The deal was sealed when Parliament bought the king from the Covenanters for £400,000. Cheap at the price, Charles remarked. The king was taken to Holdenby House in Northamptonshire.
Despite Charles's military and political incapacity, he was still crucial to finding a settlement to the civil wars. In an age of monarchy, no solution to the troubles of the 1640s seemed possible without him. So, whoever controlled the king controlled the political agenda. Though Charles was technically a prisoner here at Holdenby House, he was still the king and expected to be treated as such. During his 5-month stay, he enjoyed the services of almost 100 staff, including 16 kitchen staff with 2 pastry chefs, 2 chaplains, 6 grooms of the bedchamber, 1 hairdresser, and numerous others, including physicians, apothecaries, and robe makers. It was hardly porridge.
While Charles was living it up at Holdenby, a new political player had emerged in the Civil War. The new model army was becoming increasingly militant. The troops believed they had served Parliament well by defeating a tyrannical king and preventing a Catholic takeover. Their resentment was further fueled by the months of back pay they were still owed. When rumours began to circulate in the camps that they might be packed off to Ireland, they suspected Parliament was negotiating a secret deal with the king.
The new model army believed itself on a divine mission, and they expected a hero's welcome at the end of it, not the stitch-up prepared by Parliament. This fusion of political and religious radicalism came together in a powerful statement of principle. We were not a mere mercenary army called forth to serve any arbitrary power of a state, but had taken up arms to fight for our rights and liberties, to assert and to vindicate the just power and rights of this kingdom.
Parliament wanted rid of its troublesome new model army, who were now blocking any possible deal with the king. But it was the army who moved first.
On June the 2nd, Charles was enjoying a pleasant day playing bowls with his 2 parliamentary guards, when a junior officer from the army, Cornet Joyce, rode up to Holdenby House with 2 troops of cavalry and demanded the king accompany him. Asked by what right he importuned the monarch, Joyce showed Charles his 500 well-armed cavalrymen. The king acquiesced. He was now in the hands of the army. Charles went along with the army, and as their prisoner, hoped to further the army's growing differences with Parliament. In the face of such splits, he refused to countenance any settlements or negotiations. Charles hoped to divide his enemies, turn them on each other, and walk away in triumph.
But an increasing number of people were now toying with truly revolutionary ideas, none more so than the soldier-turned-activist John Lilburne. He argued that since all men were equal before God, so they should be equal before the law. Lilburne and his followers became known as the Levellers. They demanded the Church of England be divorced from the state, the end of press censorship, and above all the vote, but only for men.
All this talk of equality, democracy and justice was music to the ears of a disgruntled and weary army. These levellers seemed to have the answer to all their problems, and Lilburne's ideas swept like wildfire through the camps, especially his notion that Parliament was in fact just as corrupt as the king.
Cromwell saw Lilburne as a dangerous radical. But Lilburne was extremely popular among the rank and file of the New Model Army. So against his will, Cromwell was forced to debate the Leveller Manifesto. The debates took place in Putney, on the outskirts of London.
It was here at Putney Church that a battle of ideas took place that have influenced our politics to this day. Ideas which led men to demand a say over their future, over their politics and communities and how their money was spent. You could say that this was the birthplace of British socialism, the right of the lowliest individual to have a say in the shape of their society. It was the beginning of a process that would eventually end in votes for all. In October 1647, the General Council of the Army met to debate these issues. On one side, the Levellers argued for an extension of the vote to nearly all men. In the immortal words of Colonel Rainsborough, "I think the poorest he in England has a life to live as the greatest he." These were truly radical ideas, the right to vote, the right to bring those in power to account. But on the other side sat Cromwell and the socially conservative army grandees. As a substantial landowner, Cromwell had always believed in private property and insisted that only property holders with a fixed permanent interest, in other words, those with a substantial amount of real estate, should have the right to vote.
In the end, the Leveller demands were just too radical for Cromwell and the army grandees. The debates were wound up, and when rebellion flared up again, Cromwell's reaction was swift and merciless. At one army camp, some of the Levellers were taken out and shot.
The message couldn't be clearer. This was not a debating society, it was an army. The New Model Army was built on discipline, and that was needed now more than ever, because Charles had escaped. On November the 11th, 1647, Charles gave his guards the slip and headed south for the coast, where a boat was waiting to take him to Jersey. There was, however, one problem with this plan: the New Forest. In its maze of trees and paths, Charles got hopelessly lost. By the time they arrived at the coast, news of the escape was out, and Charles was forced to accept a highly unsatisfactory backup plan: the Isle of Wight. There, he was immediately taken into captivity by the parliamentary governor of the island. It was a strategic disaster. Charles's position now seemed utterly hopeless. Yet it didn't stop him plotting.
Charles had few friends left in England, and his Catholic supporters in Ireland were now in retreat. But in a last, desperate gamble, Charles entered into an extraordinary alliance with his old enemy, the Scottish Covenanters. The New Model Army was a hotbed of the most extreme Protestant ideas of the day, which the Scottish Covenanters saw as a threat to their own church. It was this fear that drove them into the arms of King Charles.
Charles and the Covenanters came together for a final fling. In December 1647, they signed the engagement and set in train another wave of conflict. The three kingdoms were back on the path towards total war. But the Second Civil War would be nothing like so finely balanced as the first.
A second civil war began in March 1648 with a pro-royalist uprising. Across the country, communities resentful of Parliament's taxes and authoritarian style of government rose up against the new model army. The Scottish Covenanters marched into England to fight for the king. But at the Battle of Preston, they proved no match for Cromwell's troops. As Cromwell brutally suppressed the rebellion in England, a revengeful mood gripped the new model army. There was now a desperate desire to stop Charles once and for all. In December 1648, Charles was transferred by the Roundheads from the Isle of Wight to Hurst Castle on the south coast.
Engineering the Second Civil War was the worst thing Charles could have done. It sealed his fate. For the new model army, the will of God had been shown in the First Civil War, when the Roundheads beat the Cavaliers on the field of battle. By plunging the country back into civil war, Charles was seen to be not only an irresponsible king with little regard for the well-being of his people, but also, crucially, defying the judgment of God. And for that sin, he needed to be called to account.
Jutting out into the sea, Hurst Castle is a pretty grim place. Isolated and windswept, it was a far cry from the comforts of Holdenby House. There are no pastry chefs or grooms of the bedchamber here.
Locked in his dank cell at Hurst Castle, Charles must have realised his time was up and started to think about preserving the principle of monarchy. Old adversaries came to him with favourable treaties, offering Charles a way out. But he refused to accept any deal which placed fundamental limitations on his power as an absolute monarch. Charles was king by divine right and would live or die as such. As he said, "I am resolved rather to shipwreck my person than either my conscience or beliefs." The game plan had now changed. Charles was determined to play the martyr.
With all his comforts withdrawn, Charles's only solace was a daily 2-mile walk along the narrow shingle spit that connected his jail to the mainland. Here, Charles must have contemplated the disastrous consequences of his actions.
For us to believe what we believe, we must have some basis. The women are tainted.
The new model army wanted no more negotiations or deals with such an untrustworthy king. At a prayer meeting in Windsor, the troops were defiant. They agreed that it was our duty, if ever the Lord brought us back again in peace, to call King Charles I, that man of blood, to an account for that blood he had shed against the Lord's cause. The new model army wanted justice. In fact, they wanted his head. The job of eliminating the king was given to Cromwell's son-in-law, Henry Ireton. Ireton was a radical Puritan and a ruthless operator. But he realised if the king was simply assassinated, there would be popular uproar. Ireton needed an official stamp of approval, and so presented to Parliament a bill demanding Charles be tried on the charge of treason. But there were some in Parliament who still hoped for a negotiated settlement with the king. They had to go.
Ireton did what so many military coup leaders do. He rigged the system to give the army a veneer of legitimacy. On the 6th of December 1648, he purged Parliament of all opposition. He ordered Colonel Pride of the new model army to stand in front of the House of Commons and turn away any member likely to resist. It was simple. If your name wasn't down, you weren't getting in.
Around 140 MPs were prevented from entering the Commons. Another 40 were arrested. This was a nasty little coup, as squalid and brutal as anything in Iraq or Burma today. All that was left was a rump parliament of 56 MPs, ready and willing to carry out the army's every wish. The trial of Charles I was like putting a man on the moon. At the time, it seemed simply inconceivable, so when it did happen, it changed everything.
All the old views of divine right and kingship were thrown away. The world had now been turned completely upside down. Ideas about monarchy, government, parliament, all of these would never be the same again.
Charles was brought to London, and on the 20th of January 1648, a High Court of Justice convened in Westminster Hall. The charge was that Charles I had attempted to subvert the ancient and fundamental laws and liberties of this nation, and in their place to introduce an arbitrary and tyrannical government, and hath prosecuted it with fire and sword.
How on earth could a king commit treason? Surely Charles couldn't commit a crime against himself. But the court argued the king was separate from the kingdom, and by levying war against Parliament and the English people, Charles had indeed committed treason.
Parliament now saw itself, not the king, as representing the will of the people.
The king was told he was answerable to Parliament as the sovereign and highest court of justice, the sole maker of the law. Charles answered, "I am your king. I have a trust committed to me by God. I will not betray that trust to answer to a new, unlawful authority." Again and again, he returned to the issue of legitimacy. By what authority was he being tried? This was a fascinating debate, a defining moment in our nation's history, a clash of ideas between king and parliament, between monarchy and democracy.
Charles's defence was ignored, and after 5 days the verdict was delivered. The king was condemned by the court as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. He was to be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. A kangaroo court of a military junta had taken upon itself the right of life and death over the nation's monarch. This was not a triumph of republican ideology, it was political necessity, pure and simple. The verdict had been sealed months beforehand. For war to end, Charles had to go. The death warrant was drawn up. Yet despite the guilty verdict, many of the judges either fled or hesitated before committing their names. Less than half of the court signed the warrant. But Cromwell forced it through, even holding one man's wavering hand. On the morning of January the 30th, 1649, King Charles I awoke here at St James's Palace.
At 5 a.m, he rose, prayed and requested 2 shirts. The weather was bitterly cold, and Charles didn't want people to think he was shivering through fear. He groomed and dressed immaculately, readying himself for his betrothal to God and the future of monarchy. At 10 a.m, an armed guard came for him. Charles strode across St James's Park, through Horse Guards Parade, and then entered Whitehall. He marched on to Banqueting House. In front of it stood a scaffold, draped in black. At 2 p.m, Charles walked out of this window at Banqueting House onto the scaffold.
He said, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world." He tucked his hair under a white satin cap and lay down his head on the executioner's block.
His last word was "remember."
His head was struck from his body in one fell swipe. As his severed head was held aloft, a low, awful groan came up from the crowd.
Through military genius and dogged energy, Cromwell achieved what Charles always wanted, and ironically, a lot of what Cromwell had originally taken up arms against.
The creation of a single British state. But Cromwell's Commonwealth was not the republic the levellers and religious freedom fighters had hoped for. It was a war state of soulless oppression, an England where even Christmas and maypoles were banned, Scotland governed from London and drained of resources, and Ireland viciously oppressed by an occupying force. Even the Westminster Parliament was soon disbanded, replaced by Cromwell's protectorate or dictatorship. Was this really a state worth fighting for? The civil wars were the product of political failure. And it was a failure that cost 250,000 lives. The system of monarchy of the early 17th century simply couldn't accommodate the competing religious dogmas of England, Ireland and Scotland, especially under such a hapless king as Charles I.
We shouldn't see the Civil War in the same light as the great revolutions which took place in France and Russia. The revolution here did not produce any long-term change in the state. In 1660, when Charles II retook the throne, almost everything was returned to its pre-Civil War status.
I think the lasting and universal bequest of the civil wars was not political, but intellectual.
In an era of devolution and self-government, England, Scotland and Ireland are once again debating the precise nature of the relationship between them. At a time of growing republicanism, the legitimacy of monarchy is being called into question once more, and the basis for electoral franchise, the principle of religious toleration, the ideal of socialism, all appeared for the first time during the revolutionary frenzy of the 1640s. These ideas profoundly influenced the history of the British state over the following centuries, but they also went abroad. The debates and ideas of the Civil War can be seen at work across the world, and that's why it remains the most fascinating period of our island's history.
For a free study guide about the Civil War and listings of other Open University programmes, you can visit our website at open2.net/Civil War or call us on 0870 900 0312.